Excellent. Thank you very much for coming today. We'll be talking about data standardization. First, a quick intro. My name is Ferreyra. I've done a lot of things over the years. I was originally in electronics and then shifted towards natural resources and eventually agriculture and food. Been working on data topics for almost 3 decades and in data interoperability topics for about 17 years. Initially working one-on-one with companies that the company I worked for integrated with, and then in the context of organizations that look to make it easier to interoperate, like Gateway, ASABE, AEF, and the International Organization for Standardization, ISO. My goal is to enable frictionless data sharing and processing while also protecting the rights of the originators and owners of the data. Right? Very important to always be thinking about data ethics by design in what we do. And why are we here? Over the past couple of years, I co-led a team of about 180 experts from 20 countries that were tasked with trying to understand the standards landscape within ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, to look for gaps, see what are the problems. We know that in general, data interoperability in the industry is a disaster, right? But how can we specifically point out where the big problems are? And can we develop a strategy to address them? And so we worked on that. We produced a final report. ISO loved it, and the wheels started turning. So one of the things that happened as a result is that ISO has created a technical committee on data-driven agrifood systems. It still hasn't had its first meeting yet, which will happen in April, but we've got 39 countries signed up already, which is significant, right? And more are joining. So that will be a home for the development of new standards for data interoperability across agricultural and food industry. So this is relevant to you. And I want to share that with you. So, the fact is that the challenges in both agriculture and food production are real, and this production is a complex, adaptive process that's getting harder every day. There's hundreds of decisions that have to be taken per crop season, and it's complex, even for the smallest of the small growers to the biggest conglomerate. Of course, the smaller you are, the smaller the producer, the more vulnerable they are, the less access they have to inputs, credit, risk management instruments, and so forth, right? And in the past, many of these decisions were made based on what mom and dad did and adapting to what the neighbors were doing. But increasingly, we have to start making decisions based on data. Things are changing too fast to do otherwise. So if we look at a very simplified model, an example maybe of how this can be seen. We've got say a primary supply chain here, and I'm sorry I can't see my cursor. Yeah, so if you look at that big arrow, think of it as a primary supply chain where we've got input manufacturers, and distributors, and retailers, and then say the agricultural producer, and whoever buys from them. Then a little bit condensed, we've got the things that happen in this conference, processors, CPGs, and so forth. Finally, reaching the consumer and their dinner plate, right? But this is more of a network of actors, because there's regulators, and then you have equipment manufacturers for all the different steps of this journey. You've got advisors, you've got test labs, you've got other sources of data. They're all exchanging information. right? And this is very valuable as a way of supporting their processes, right? If you don't know how your processes are performing, if you don't know how your machines are performing, you miss out on the opportunity for increased efficiencies. If you aren't capturing what you're doing out in the field, you can't do your regulatory reporting. You can't figure out if you can afford a rent increase, and so forth, right? So I do want to point out that small producers have a lot of difficulty engaging with these sorts of data exchanges. While they produce about half of the world's food, they have less access to a bunch of different things. So let's move on to the idea of standards. An interesting example that I was looking at recently was a new idea called inclusive value chain development, where a funder, maybe the World Bank or somebody like that, Gates Foundation, can set up a program involving maybe small growers of rice or something like that, and then mills and processors that they work with, and they provide working capital for the mills, and working capital for the smallholder farmers. They arrange for extension services to help provide capacity building and so forth, where the farmers get access to credit, agronomic advice, risk management instruments. The buyers secure higher volumes, higher quality, and so forth, right? The thing is that this has been piloted many times, but it's very hard to scale up. And why? Because there's a lot of data exchange happening in these things, and there's a lot of friction. When you're trying to scale these things up, those data exchanges are very, very difficult. Now, if you have standards so that everyone can use the same formats, everybody can use the same codes or codes that are related in a way that can be understood by machines, then all of this becomes a lot easier as different systems start talking the same language. And in every segment of the agri-food industry, you're always hearing complaints from your customers saying, why can't these things just talk to one another, right? So that's what we're talking about here. When you're not using standards, you've got a bunch of data producers and a bunch of data consumers, and they end up having to make all these point-to-point integrations. If you've ever lived in that world of having to implement that stuff, and I have, it's nightmarish, because at some point you have to deal with so many integrations, so many partners that are changing things on you on the fly, that your support line is ringing off the hook with angry customers. They're angry at you, right? And it's not really your fault that somebody else changed something in an API. But when you have standards, you have a shot at things being a lot easier if everybody is connecting to that standard, putting their data in that format with those codes, using those APIs, and consuming accordingly, right? So we're in a bind. The 21st century demands that we scale up these data exchanges so that we can support not only producing food, but produce it in a way that conforms to standard best practices, best scientific principles, and so forth. And this principled decision-making support just isn't supported in turn by standards. Why? In no small part, it's because our industry grew bottom up, and the standardization efforts grow bottom up too, right? You get a group of interested people that get together with the best intentions to make things easier, and they come up with a standard. But there's rarely a guarantee that that standard can interoperate with another when data is involved, right? So ISO realized this a few years ago and took some action. Like I told you, they chartered a strategic advisory group right, that I co-chaired with a gentleman from Germany. And now they've created this technical committee 347. So what am I asking of you? Get involved through your professional organization or directly. So through your professional organization, be it AFIA or whoever, get your company involved so that you can have a seat at the table. In the years I've been in the standard space, I've seen very, very little cloak and dagger stuff. Usually people just show up, everybody's tired, everybody's busy, they understand, check your weapons at the door and just get stuff done, right? It's an exercise to learn to define pre-competitive spaces, so knowing where competitors can agree that let's just work together to get this out of the way so that we can compete on our core competencies, right? That happens, I've seen it work again and again and again. So what I've seen is that standards end up being made by the people that show up, right? So I can look you in the eye and say, if you show up, your interests are more than likely going to be considered and included, right? That's what I see well over 95% of the time. This takes some money, right? But it's usually nothing compared to the cost of implementing a standard, and absolutely nothing compared to the cost of reinventing the wheel, right? Which is what, I don't know, I've done several times. It's so horrible to have some big project when you go and you design this architectural thing and you find out years later after you spent, $2 million, you realize that there was an ISO standard that you could have used. Of course, one of the messages that the Strategic Advisory Group gave to ISO was, guys, your standards are very well kept secrets, right? The industry needs to know about them a lot better, right? So we've started working with their communications team to make these things more accessible. Also, get involved directly, right? Your experiences, knowledge, and perspective are really important. Tell us what processes in your segment of the industry give you trouble, where the data exchanges are important but don't work out very well, right? In general, standards are made when there are pain points that are identified. And people say, let's just solve this, right? Please contact us if you want to know more. Of course, what's in it for you? When there's data standards in place, digital tools become a lot easier to use, right? I've seen it happen where, in my case, mostly growers would say like, hey, I like how this software works. And you ask them why. I don't know, it just works. It can talk to other stuff. Under the hood, we have all this complex stuff, translating and so forth. If you did your job right, your end user just finds things easier, right? And there's an infinite number of examples where data standards can help. The idea behind all this is to help you be more profitable, more sustainable, and more compliant with the regulations that can get you in trouble if you aren't, right? So we're having a new technical committee. Like I said, you can sign up to be part of the mirror committee that manages your country's position in this technical committee. So if you're in the US, there's a US mirror committee, led, by the way, by that handsome devil back there, Brian Kemp, who'll be around to take questions also. And if you're in Singapore, Singapore has its own mirror committee, France has its own, and so forth. Like I said, we're at 39 countries right now. ASABE, the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers, is the organization that manages the US Mirror Committee, right? So this other handsome devil right here, Scott Cederquist, is the standards director of ASABE. So you can talk to him, or go to ASABE's stand, which is over on that far corner over there, to learn more about how you can participate, okay? That way you can inject requirements and necessary capabilities of your industry segment into the things that we're going to do. So there is a technical committee, there's also an international workshop on a reference architecture for data-driven agri-food systems that I would love to discuss. And ultimately what we're trying to do is enable scale and data exchange across both local, regional, and global value chains. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. That QR code will take you to, I believe, ASABE's Mirror Committee page where you can learn more. Now, if you're not based in the US and you come from another country, just follow that barcode anyway. The nice folks at ASABE will tell you who to talk with in your own country, okay? So with that, thank you very much.